I'd like to first welcome everybody to the third Transformative Conversation that is going to be focusing on transdisciplinarity and co-production of knowledge, recognizing that there are different ways of knowing and that these can contribute differentially to transformative change. My name is Karen O'Brien, and I'm a professor of human geography at the University of Oslo. And I've been working with Håkon Stokland from the Social Science and Humanities Network to try to engage in different types of conversations to bring together diverse perspectives on transformative change. So this is the third of our and final of our conversations, and we're really delighted to welcome you here today because the aim of these conversations really is to engage with diverse perspective and engage with your perspectives as well, and really think about transformative change in a more reflexive and inclusive manner. So today we're going to explore what co-production and transdisciplinary mean in the context of transformative change, and how they might be able to support different types of practices, different types of ways of engaging with change. So I'm just going to go over the flow for today's conversation, and then we'll introduce our speakers and get started. So just a few practical things at first is that when you're not speaking, just mute yourself just so that we don't pick up any background noise. And we're going to turn off the chat during the actual conversation so that we don't get distracted. And then we'll open it up again during the question period. And during the question period, you can ask different questions and make comments by typing them into the chat or by raising your hand with the little hand function, and we will call on you and highlight you for the conversation. And we just want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and the link will be sent out to everybody after the event. We won't include the breakout groups because we will have about a 10 to 15 minute breakout session where we'll post some questions where we can all share our perspectives with each other. So I still see people entering the room, so just welcoming everyone to those. But I would like to just first introduce my co-organizer, Håkon Stokland, who's a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research in Trondheim, Norway. And his research is focused on the relations between knowledge and politics, biodiversity, and transformative change. And he's a lead author on the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment and a main coordinator of the Social Sciences and Humanities Network. And so I will pass it to him, and yeah, and we'll just get to start getting going. Thanks. So welcome, Håkon.
Thanks, Karen. And hi, everyone. Really nice to see everyone here. Let me just shortly introduce you, Karen, as well, since you introduced me before we get on with the program. So Karen O'Brien is a professor of human geography at the University of Oslo in Norway and co-founder of Sea Change, an organization that works to engage society with transformations to sustainability. Her research emphasizes integral approaches to sustainability, and she is passionate about transformative change in both theory and practice. She is currently a co-chair of the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment. So let's go on to the topic of today's conversation. So I'll do a short introduction before we move on to our panel. So calls for transdisciplinarity and co-production have increased in recent years, in particular in relation to calls for sustainability transformations or transformative change. By bringing together diverse perspectives, knowledge, and action, it's hoped that co-production can contribute to redefining how problems are understood and promoting more legitimate and actionable knowledge. This is because co-production not only focuses on filling knowledge gaps, but also on how the process contributes to questioning assumptions and structures that have historically marginalized certain actors, perspectives, and knowledge systems. Thus, in addition to generating new knowledge, co-production is often expected to promote transformations in the actors and institutions that produce it. And as many of you know, this is the third in a series of 3 transformative conversations that we've been hosting. And interestingly, a central theme that emerged during the other two conversations, so the first one was on environmental assessments, and the second on justice in conservation, was the need to involve more actors, including the diversity of knowledge systems and values at play in a pluralistic manner. So this is something that has come up in previous conversations as well. So among the benefits attributed to co-production processes are fostering expanded agency for justice, elevating marginalized agendas, challenging dominant agendas, navigating conflicting agendas, exploring diverse agendas, and creating broad ownership and action for transformative socio-ecological change. However, there are still many questions and debates about how co-production can be conducted in practice, how it can impact policy and wider transformations, and how different knowledge systems can dialogue horizontally. Many different ways of conducting co-production exist with different methods and aims, and the ability of many methods and approaches to deal properly with power asymmetries and contribute to fundamental structural transformations have been questioned. Risks of reinforcing unsustainable structures and practices through co-production have also been pointed out. So there's lots of debate and discussion about this. And with this conversation, we hope to highlight and add to the current debates about transdisciplinarity and co-production of transformative change. And this is why we have invited 4 inspiring experts on these topics today. So let's start with the introductions. First, we have Josephine, or Josie in short, Chambers. She's an assistant professor at the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University. As a transdisciplinary social scientist, her work focuses on the role of narratives, play, knowledge co-production, and collaborative governance to navigate tensions among perspectives, question dominant discourse, and facilitate collective imagination in diverse settings in Europe, Latin America, and Africa. Welcome, Josie. Second, we have Mrinalini Rai. She is the director of Women for Biodiversity and the coordinator of the UN CBD Women's Caucus. She has worked for several years advocating for the rights of indigenous people, local communities, and women and youth in various local to global dialogues. She strongly believes in the ground level movement and the strength of communities' experiences and voices. As an indigenous woman, she sees gender as inextricably linked with the indigenous people's experience and as an issue that cuts across sectors. Welcome, Mrinalini.
We'll
and then I pass it to you.
Yeah, we'll get her spotlighted, and I'll continue with the introductions of our third guest today is Maria Tengo, who is a research leader of the Biosphere Stewardship Stream at the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Nature College Special Chair in Human-Nature Relationships in the Anthropocene at the Wageningen University. She's currently leading research projects on the co-production of knowledge for syntheses across scientific, local, and indigenous knowledge systems, and focusing on a sense of place and cultural ecosystem services in Southern Africa. And she's also looking at emerging stewardship networks in Bangalore, India. So welcome, Maria. And finally, we have Andy Sterling, who's a professor of science and technology policy in the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, where he co-directed the ERC STEP Center for 16 years. His research focuses especially on the issues of power, uncertainty, and diversity in science and society. He sat on the UK and EU regulatory bodies on energy policy, toxic substances, genetically modified crops, and science advice and public engagement. So we have 4 wonderful speakers who have diverse perspectives on co-production and transdisciplinary. And what we want to do is really have a conversation, a free-flowing conversation. In other words, a way of really sharing ideas and perspectives. And we've been starting each of these conversations with just a quick question to you about what matters to you and what really motivates and what values drive your research and get you up and keep you going in the day. So why don't we start with, we'll start with Josie.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to see so many people joining from around the world. Yeah, and I would say that my motivation has shifted a lot throughout my life, actually. I started out actually as a honeybee geneticist, and then I studied monkeys out in the wild, and then I became a political ecologist, and then into knowledge co-production, and now I work in a future studio, so engage much more with imagination. And so maybe I think the kind of underlying motivation behind all of that is to really kind of question purpose of why do I think a certain way of producing knowledge or a certain way of relating with people is valuable, and to always try my best to not become too fixed in that answer. And to really kind of remain open to learning from other people. And I guess who knows then where the next trajectory is. But really curious to learn from everyone here and keep advancing this conversation.
Great, super. And how about you, Mrinalini? What motivates you and keeps you going?
Hi, everybody. Once again, from my side too. Hello from Thailand. I think it's a very important discussion that it really needs to be addressed. And I'm really happy that you're actually bringing in perspectives from different sectors already. That's also a good start, because I think the transdisciplinary approach to things, when understanding from, I'm going to be giving the gender perspective, is to be able to, when you talk about co-production of knowledge, is to really ensure that it's not only knowledge that is collected, but I think like Håkon talked about, one thing which I caught my attention was actionable knowledge. So I think transdisciplinary approach will really also give that approach to see how these different elements would be really looked into that, because at the end, these approaches for me needs to do something, like where I'm working on advocacy spaces at the international level. And, you know, we're always talking about that everything has to be with the local led initiative, at the national ownership. So I think that interdisciplinary approach may definitely be an approach to really understanding or being able to negotiate these spaces.
Great. So it sounds like you're motivated by the need for action in this area. And how about you, Maria?
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. So I think for me, especially then thinking about co-production of knowledge, my motivation comes very much from growing up in an area which was very rich in biodiversity, but also very clearly a biocultural landscape. So where people engaging and caring about the landscape is creating the values and the biodiversity. But then also actually growing up more or less at a research field station where the father was an entomologist. So kind of in this coexisting world, so this very rural, local, close to nature place, but also an academic perspective. And I think the sense making between these different worlds is motivating me, and ways to be able to connect the curiosity that drives me as a researcher with something that can actually matter in these local places. Yes, I think that's at the core of what motivates me, the kind of the sense making and doing research that can matter and finding ways to do that. So I would like to just add to my bio that I've also been senior advisor at Swed Bio for now almost 10 years. And that's been a key thing for me to also, that the research can matter in policy and practice as well.
Great. And Andy, what about you?
Well, so what motivates me? Yikes. I mean, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a privilege to be in this group. And I think what motivates me, to be honest, I'm old now. I came out of the environment, peace and social justice movements, different ways before coming into academia. And it's about challenging power for me. That's my motivation, to be honest. That's not necessarily something to be proud of in general, but I think power isn't bad necessarily, but it's most likely to become bad if it's not challenged. And specifically in research, because I think that was also part of your question, motivating in research, I think then looking for the gaps that power and privilege cause inside knowledge, because there's huge amounts of uncertainty. We don't know much, we're unsure about a lot more things than we claim. But actually, if you look at yourself, as other people have said, ourselves as knowledge production systems and see where are we systematically blind, where are our biases, then you can see some of the most interesting implications for research. So I guess those are a couple of motivations.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks. That's a great start. So let's get a little more into the topic now, and let's start, I don't know, let's call it the basics. So what is transdisciplinarity to you, and why is it important? So let's start with you, Maria.
Yes, thank you. So transdisciplinarity to me, coming from a sustainability design perspective, where there is a call for research to matter, right? That we are doing research that can change and engage with society in a way that to make sure that the research and the work is relevant and useful and actionable, as Marinalini said. But I think it's also the other way around. We also need to learn from policy and practice. So it's the kind of the feedback between the research and the real world, so to speak, the actual policy and practice around biodiversity and sustainability challenges. And to me, it is really evident that the complex multidimensional challenges that we stand for with sustainability and biodiversity governance cannot be addressed by one single discipline, but it also cannot be addressed only in academia. And that's, of course, the fundamental idea with the need for transformative change, right? So we need multiple perspectives. We need to bring in the lived experiences, and we need to bring in other knowledge systems, other ways of knowing and learning and governing biodiversity in ecosystems. So that's why I think it's important and the role it can play in the research.
And for you, Josie, do you have a similar idea what transdisciplinary are and why it's important?
Yeah, I think my view relates very closely to what Maria just said. I think it's so difficult to pin down what is transdisciplinarity, because actually it just means so many different things, and there's so much value actually in all of those differences. But then it's also really useful to be critical and reflective about what different approaches to transdisciplinarity can bring in different situations, and also their limitations. And so I think actually kind of what motivated me into transdisciplinarity was just feeling like the approaches to producing knowledge that I used earlier in my career were much more kind of this accountant of destruction of producing knowledge about how things are getting worse and worse. I think through my role in political ecology, I got a little bit frustrated with feeling like I was using too much that speaking truth to power, which certainly has a really important role from one angle. But I think as I moved more and more into co-production and learned so much about different approaches around the world, I really started to value how do you find this balance between scientists actually relinquishing a lot of control in terms of what they decide to focus on and how they go about producing knowledge, but in ways that are more intertwined with action, but then also not falling into the trap of handing over all of that power to societal actors to decide all of those things. And so finding that balance of power between different actors to really challenge each other's assumptions around questions of power and justice. So yeah, many answers, but I'll leave it at that.
And
Yeah,
raising,
thanks. Sorry.
And I was thinking that, raising that issue of power, it would be interesting. Andy, what do you think in terms of transdisciplinarity, what it means from a power perspective?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's a struggle, isn't it? Because actually, people like me will make claims of what it means because we've staked a lot in it, but I'm really unsure. I'm finding out all the time. But I'd say, yes, for me, power is central. Power in knowledge production, as Josie and others were saying. But it not just because, again, as Josie mentioned, there's such an importance to speak truth to power. That is incredibly important. But it's also equally important to recognize how power shapes truth. The truth that we're telling is already shaped by power. And no one is more vulnerable to that than critics, whose own truth is shaped by the very power they are challenging. So, for instance, the fact that scale plays such a large role, the fact that we're so reductive in so many scientific approaches, these are not independent of intellectual property rights, of hierarchical societies. So the things that we think are intrinsic to achieving transformation are often shaped by the very power structures that we're trying to transform. So transdisciplinarity, then, for me, is about the power relations. It's not just about including different knowledges. Anyone can do that with kind of etiquettes that are now very well developed to look at the diversity here. What really matters are the terms of trade between the different knowledges, the power relations, the privilege relations between them. And unless we talk about those, I fear it's not self-evident what that means, but I fear we're missing the real importance of transdisciplinarity.
Tina, do you have anything to add? Or Mrinalini, I recognize that you're recovering from COVID, so.
It's fine. No, I think I don't want to add too much on what everybody already has said, but definitely I think key points that I would kind of just build up on is I think very important are the power dynamics within different diverse knowledge holders. The interdisciplinary approach to that becomes really very crucial, because that also shifts deciding of who is leading those discussions. So I think for me, transdisciplinarity is quite interesting, because for me it's not stagnant. It's something like it's an ongoing process which you may need to kind of come back to kind of recheck. It's very evolving, and I think like what Maria talked about, I want to stress the same thing, is that it's the lived experiences with changes, either you talk about ecologically or geographically or age-wise or whatever, but that work in the research work, well, it's good and bad. It's good because it has so much of diverse knowledge to kind of go ahead with it, but also like these power struggles and how they would really be also engaged is challenging, but at the same time, it also has some opportunities.
Great. So and let's get a little back to you, Andy. So what you mentioned earlier about how knowledge is shaped by power. So what kind of implications to you does this have for whether transformative change can be co-produced? Should it be co-produced, or does it need to be? And how does co-production of transformative change work then, or how can you achieve it? What are your thoughts about this?
Thanks for an easy question. I mean, obviously, it all depends on what we mean by co-production, and I'm a little bit suspicious of the latitude for interpretation of a lot of the key words in the middle of our inquiry. I think it's not a coincidence that these words have come to the fore, because they allow people to organize around them with very different interests. And so we have to, if we're interested in progressive transformation that genuinely challenges power and privilege, we need to really look hard at that. So for instance, co-production, what does it mean? Does it just mean including diverse actors, which is often how it's glossed? Well, it's like a slave, forgive the analogy, but a slave society includes diverse actors. It's the terms of trade that matter. Inclusion of itself, diversity of itself, are not guarantors of any kind of progressive transformation. So for me, what we mean by co-production, so if we just mean collective, diverse, then of course transformation has to be co-produced. In fact, almost what other kind of, do we think transformation is sometimes controlled by a particular actor? I can't think of a single transformation of any kind, let alone progressive, that was actually not co-produced in a collective, diverse sense. It's like, it's culture. It's much bigger than any of these power structures that like to tell stories of their own agency. It's beyond their agency. Of course it's co-produced. The question is by which interests, privileging which kinds of orientations. So, but then if we're more demanding about co-production, then we get into some sticky waters. I mean, we've maybe come onto this, but for me, I think there are not just different meanings, Eleanor Ostrom or Sheila Jasanoff co-production, not just different meanings, they are opposite in important ways in relation to power, which we may come into. So I don't know, Håkon, I'm sorry, it's a bit of an academic answer, but I think we really need to unpack some of these words rather than just trot them out, because otherwise we're in danger of being manipulated.
Yeah, I think that's good, and it's an important part of the conversation that we should have here today, I think. So are there any reactions to this? Maria, maybe, do you have any reaction to this? Yeah.
Yes. No, I agree in many ways, and I think in particular that it's used so broadly, and that can be quite problematic. And there's a great need to talk more about what do we mean when we engage with the concepts. And I think, for example, the papers that that Josie have led recently about starting to disentangle what are the different underlying assumptions and the goals and the different contexts for different kinds of co-production is really important to spell out those underlying assumptions. So who are involved, what are the goals, and what do you want to achieve, and how, and acknowledging the setting. So I agree also with Andy, who said, or he was putting out the Jasana versus Ostrom. There's a really wide range of kinds of approaches. I think you would explain it better than I would. And I see a need for the different kinds. They don't necessarily need to agree, but again, you need to be explicit and transparent about what you're doing. And come back to what Joseph said, also be able to think about what are the limitations and the challenges with each of them.
Great, Josie. Yeah, why don't you've unpacked co-production and the different types of co-production. Maybe you could say something about that. I think we just dropped off Andy's. Oh, there.
Oh, yeah. Maybe connecting also to what Andy said earlier about the importance of understanding the dynamics of how power shapes truth in a system. I think that is such an important element of designing co-production processes, because we don't really understand, if you take truth as just kind of a given and you don't understand all of the power dynamics behind how even notions of truth were created in the first place, then it really limits any kind of intervention attempt that you do to shift how actors are coming together to gain some sort of alternative notion of what's going on and construct truth. Again, it's always so subjective in terms of how people are making meaning. And I think the risk is that so often when we see work done about co-production or transdisciplinarity, is we get these really generic terms and frameworks that say, oh, we need to be more inclusive, without really kind of digging into what does inclusivity actually mean. And I mean, one thing that we found through the studies that Maria was also a part of, that she mentioned, is that oftentimes we have this trapping of these multi-stakeholder inclusive platforms where it's just assumed very simplistically that you just need to get people involved or people to the table, that really overlooks the ways, the design considerations for who decides how to bring people to the table, and how maybe it shouldn't even be a table in terms of actually balancing people's perspectives and really understanding these multiple views of what truth is, and navigating those different perspectives and where they came from.
Right. And that brings us then to that there are different ways of just understanding reality in and of itself. And Tina Rinalini, maybe you could mention what types of blind spots do you see in the conversations that we're having about co-production in your perspective?
I agree with a lot of, I agree with whatever the discussions are happening, but it also kind of really got me thinking is, I mean, I think it was a mention about how things get popular. I think even the word co-production is quite popular. Co-production of knowledge and how to really engage the guidelines. I think, like I said before, it's also really quite challenging when you're talking about having inclusion. Exactly, the question happens upon what do you really mean by inclusion? But if you are identifying different rights holders to be part of those discussions, whether you're talking about women or you're talking about youth, or you're talking indigenous peoples, for me, it's also just starts about the guideline, what are the process of engagement? How are you maybe molding the research questions in a way that is understandable? Because sometimes the context changes, even a word, if you're in my work, if I'm going to look at gender equality, that itself word in very different cultures and communities could have a very different understanding. So I think so for the co-production, but we're talking about these rights holders, there's also a lot of richness in those diversities. So that's why I said that when I talk about co-production of knowledge, it's not like a stagnant knowledge. It evolves around generations, between communities. So I think that co-production for me is a process. And to it's really good to see that in the academic there is this recognition of having a seat for the stakeholders, for the right holders to be part of that. But I think it's also need to be really strengthened of what are those processes of truly engaging. And I'm also very afraid to use words like participation or capacity building or inclusion because they're very vague again. So like, I think Karen, you talked about, for me, something at the end of it, it is like, what are the actions? If you're talking about inclusivity, what is it? If we're talking about transformative change, what are the indicators that will show that it is transformative change? When you're talking about the interdisciplinary approach also, what are the key elements that actually truly informs the process that will, make space for all these diverse, movable knowledge? And I'll stop there.
Great, that's really interesting. And so now we talked a bit about how power might be a bit of a blind spot to some, at least, of the approaches and methods to co-production, and also the value of unpacking all these concepts that are used in various contexts and by different people with potentially different meanings. But are there any other tensions or blind spots that you see in the debates about co-production or in this more mainstream approaches to it? Let's open up for everyone. If you have anything you want to highlight.
I can add something.
Great.
So I think one tension has already, or at least partly, emerged. I think in this discussions about you need to speak truth to power and think about how power shapes truth. So you need to be vigilant and careful and pay attention to these things. But on the other hand, you also, when you're doing co-production, you also want to create an environment of trust, right? And so this is a tension that I've really felt in trying to do these processes, that you need to be careful and be attentive to the power dynamics, but also to create an environment where everyone is comfortable and feels safe to share and discuss and actually to learn together. And I think that's actually a process tension that can be quite tricky. So if you start with an agreement of how to protect knowledge and then say, okay, now let's share and discuss. It's So I think that's an interesting tension.
Andy has a reaction to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so for me, then it's the idea the medium is the message is quite important. Of course, the content really matters, but no one's surprised about it. Everyone dwells on content, but the way in which you engage. For instance, we're having a design discourse now, and so whatever we say about inclusion and progressive values inside the medium, the fact that we are engaging in a design discourse as if the challenge is to design, a little bit like the trust debate, Maria, you're absolutely right in what you said. But so often, I mean, it's so rare to find discussions of trust by the powerful of the less powerful. So often it's about the other way around. It's always up the gradient. And even trustworthiness is up the gradient. And so it's really, even though we think we're working progressively, we're developing an etiquette by which to defend existing orders. We don't intend that, but it happens. And likewise, then, if we engage in a design discourse as if co-production or transdisciplinarity or whatever the phrase is, transformation itself, are things that are designed, then in the end, the content that we come along washes out, and all that's left is, let's design a transformation, let's design. And we don't have to look at it in that controlling way. We can adopt a frame of struggle, for instance, that transdisciplinarity is a struggle, that transformation is a struggle, and a very different kind of idiom comes out of that, I think. So that's one of the blind spots are, watch out for the idiom. Watch out for how the medium is the message, and how what you're doing inadvertently is reinforcing an idea that these are controlled, orderly, hierarchical processes with box and arrow diagrams in them, which is, no matter what the content of the box is, can be counterproductive.
Maybe just building on that, I think for me, one of the most interesting tensions has been around, are we building a politics of revolution, which is really trying to make these explicit tensions of them versus us, or are we building a politics of recognition, where we're trying to build more of this deliberative process where we're kind of building together that blurs those boundaries between them and us related to problem and solution. And I think people disagree a lot on those approaches within co-production and transformation. But I very much think I guess this is a struggle because they do seem like opposites, but at the same time, we need both of those kinds of politics, because we're never, if we always take the friendly, oh, let's work together and build something, you also are so limited in terms of how you can spark change. But then if you only have this politics of revolution, then you just get this polarization that can also really hinder change. So I'm super interested how those two politics can work together. And I guess maybe that leads to, for me, I think one of the biggest blind spots is actually imagination. Because just as an example, when I was working at Vachnia recently, my research was to ask researchers what was their vision for what they thought they should be doing as a researcher to enhance their connection to transformative societal change. And people responded in such a range, from some people just kind of repeated what they're already doing through to some people felt quite kind of stuck and wanted to work in a very different way. But even among those answers, we're so limited in our imagination of how we can do things differently, because we're so stuck in how we've always done them and our views of what's possible. So I think we really need to become much more radical in our thinking on how do we open up our imagination of how things can be really different in our approaches, without falling into the other trap of being kind of trying to go forward with these VR goggles where we're so disconnected from the present that we're not actually being really serious about all of the injustices of the present and the past. And that relates to decolonization of how we produce knowledge as well. So there's a lot packed in there, but I'll stop for now, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these themes.
Yeah, that's you bring up a lot of issues, and I'll pass it over to Tina, because I think also, we talk about bringing people's voices together, but do we actually listen? And in that imagination, what are we hearing? What are we not hearing? So we talk about blind spots as visual, but also deaf spots. So like what we just silenced. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just taking notes down there. No, but thank you. I think once again, I think sometimes there are so many acronyms and jargon to really understand in depth what they really mean, because they're very heavy loaded words. Just simply, I'll just say that when we're talking about all this, we talk about power dynamics. There also are a lot of systemic barriers which are very local or very, very even micro. And also understanding that the co-production of knowledge that we're talking about, I think, of course, we're talking about the gaps and challenges. And I think one challenge for me, I would say, is how there is a growing recognition that we need to have this co-production. But again, looking at actions, I'm wondering, is that then how, as an accountability of whoever that situation is that then how do you actually give value? You might recognize that, okay, we really want to have this co-production of knowledge together. But I think what really also is the importance, I don't know my English, is, how having the equal weight to the same kind of knowledge to then inform a much more inclusive, because you could be inclusive, but then the way some scientific theories might not work with certain things. And then there's this, is power struggle, here will be the knowledge struggle. Because I think for the co-production to really be more holistic and more just, these are big words we use for being just and inclusive, then it really becomes very important. I know, and I definitely know there are challenges. We could talk about a holistic approach of knowledge, but still try to strive that how do these knowledge are given the same weight to then inform in these policy research, because these inform the international or global policy leads, and these researchers, these helps to also lead that. So how does that become a force to change that?
Great. So, and building on that, so Maria, so you have developed this multidisciplinary evidence-based approach, right? That's related to what Marina Lynn is saying here, and also the concept of weaving knowledge systems. So could you tell us a little shortly about that and why you developed it?
Yes, yes, I really like what you were saying, Marina, because I think that is really key, that how different knowledges are viewed differently, right? And I mean, okay, And we were talking, you were talking before, Andy, about the reductionist knowledge. And so how do we open up for more complementary or holistic approaches? So the multiple evidence-based approach was developed by Swedbio and partners representing organization, or in partnership with organizations representing indigenous people and local communities. And it was a response to when IPBES was founded, and IPBES was quite open-minded to, or had a strong ambition to engage with the indigenous and local knowledge, but how? And a lot of the communities and the community organizations were feeling like in many cases, it's actually been harmful for communities in bringing in their knowledge. So we started to have this conversation or dialogue around how can you do this in a way that is mutually beneficial or important. And I think that is a really key issue when you're talking about co-production between scientific, indigenous and local knowledge systems. So it's not only how indigenous and local knowledge can complement science, it's also how can these processes actually also strengthen indigenous and local governance, knowledge systems, but also governance system on the ground. So then the idea of this multiple evidence base is that it's kind of also a diplomatic approach to think about how can different knowledge systems be complementary and add different insights, but also then the really key point that it's not about knowledge or knowledge integration, it's about collaborations between knowledge systems and actors represented different knowledge systems and governance systems. So I think that's so important and I think that what's often from a scientific perspective, the view has often been maybe that we need to integrate this knowledge into scientific knowledge. And that's kind of moving away from knowledge integration into collaborations, equal collaborations between actors representing different knowledge systems that in themselves have different ways to assess what knowledge is legitimate and appropriate to share, etc. So that was kind of the idea. And one of the approaches I will not take too much space, but one of the key things that I think we try to develop in the methodology of how to create this dialogue was to do walking workshops and not have a table, as Josie was saying, but actually be in indigenous territory and talking about these issues in the landscape and be able to talk about this more practice oriented knowledge, in the setting where it's happening, so to speak.
Oh, great. I wish we could have walking Zoom workshops, but Andy, you've been nodding, and you've argued in the past that it's important that we stay attentive to the difference between diversity and pluralism, and that we just can't add different types of knowledge together and expect it to lead to something different. So maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not trying to police words, because of course people can use these words and do in all kinds of legitimately different ways. But for me, inputs and outputs, just to be clear, you can talk about diversity of outputs, diversity of inputs, of knowledges that come in, of options that are considered, perspectives, of uncertainties. They all go into the machine, but in a typical, for instance, global assessment, a typical knowledge production process of the kinds that we're talking about here, that's a cheap concession to actually claim to be taking as inputs. The key thing is aggregation of getting these things together and somehow crunching out the idea that there's a single more robust view of the issues in hand. And that's much less negotiable. That's what the system needs. That's what arguably colonial modernity is built on, the idea, despite the fact in everyday life, everything looks different from different angles. Somehow things aren't allowed to look different from different angles when it comes to global politics. And why is that? It's again the blind spot that power and privilege need justification. They need closure. So for me, the difference between plurality and diversity is that plurality is acknowledging that truth looks different, sometimes radically different, depending on the angle it's viewed from. And therefore, it's not enough to just bring in lots of inputs to a modeling exercise, as it were, or even a deliberative exercise. The key issue about how challenging it is for helping the struggle for transformation is how much does it break down the idea there's just a single view. So that's what I mean by opening up. And it's not blind pluralism. It means for each plural perspective, we need to know depending on what? Depending on what values, depending on what interests. It's plural and conditional. So it's not just let's just pluralize, anything goes. It's let's really talk to each other, not just about the content of the knowledge, but to be rigorous about what it depends on. And that way, I think, so it's not, it's in addition to being holistic and inclusive and complete in all the system kind of fashion, these are really important. It's also being pluralistic in that sense, is what I think is worth striving for. All the more so because it's so militated against. When you're on a steep landscape, to walk at the same height, you need to make a real effort, to open up, you need to really make effort. It's no problem closing down in the world as it is. It'll do it. It takes care of itself. So it's not as if we have to worry about closure not happening. We have to struggle if we want any degree of openness to survive in the sort of modernistic world we're in.
Thank you so much. Håkon, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not exactly sure how to weave this into the discussion now, but I wanted to take this up as well during the conversation. So Josie, you've developed this concept of co-productive agility, and I was wondering if you could tell us about it in short, and how this could support transformations, and also maybe related to justice in conservation. You also mentioned decolonization of knowledge earlier. So do you see a relation between this concept and decolonization of knowledge?
Yeah, thanks, Håkon. So many things in there. I think actually this follows on really nicely to what Maria was just talking about as well, because Maria was actually, she contributed through her involvement in the work she was just talking about to this analysis that led to this concept of co-productive agility. And I think her work shows in really nice ways the importance of really being very careful about how different knowledge forms are interacting, and what are kind of the methodological approaches that you're using, such as the walking workshops, the dialogue workshops, the walking dialogue workshops that Maria mentioned. And I think, so this concept of co-productive agility, what we were trying to get at with it is to get beyond this trap that we often fall into with transformation processes or co-production, where someone uses their power to decide too early on that this should be the goal of where we're all going together. Which also relates to what Andy was just saying about the trappings of having too much kind of the dominance of one view of truth. And so I think what we mean by that concept is how do you actually hold off on needing that certainty and actually cultivate the willingness of a group of diverse people to work together and actually be okay with not necessarily deciding from the outset what goal, and also hopefully having people who would have very different views of what they would think would be a valuable goal, so that they're willing to really, in a reflexive way, learn from each other, travel together to open up their imagination of where they could go, which if we're using kind of a metaphor of a map or journeys, then hopefully instead of kind of having someone who is in the car and says, we're going to this destination, everyone get on board, which would be a very, I guess, simplistic view of what co-production can do, actually kind of journeying together, maybe even walking and kind of figuring it out along the way and not going with the main network of highways and the main big destinations that everyone goes to, but trying to figure out what are some alternative ways. And I think, I mean, there's so much to say in terms of how this connects to the many discussions that are happening now about decolonizing knowledge, post-colonial approaches to knowledge production, and so many different ways and language of framing that as well. I mean, maybe I can just highlight the work of one of my PhD candidates, Cara Flores, who is looking at decolonizing mapping practices, especially in Aruba. And I think she's using a really innovative approach of looking at how maps have been excluding historically many different values in that context and been used very problematically as a tool of power, but then not just leaving it there at that critical analysis, but really building co-production processes of what does it even mean to have a decolonizing mapping process and exploring that very openly. And she's just kind of at the start of that journey now, but I'm really curious to see so many different approaches that are emerging. And I think we really have to, so much to learn in terms of how to open up these knowledge production processes in ways that are very sensitive to colonial histories.
That sounds like a really interesting study. I'm looking forward to learning more about it. And so, Marina Lini, in your experience and working toward actionable knowledge, have it in your experience usually the target for transformations to come out of co-production been set in advance, or has it been part of the process? And do you have any views on this distinction?
I think, I won't again repeat it, and I just following up with Josie that talked about, I think, like I said, that the co-production is not stagnant, and it will kind of really evolve. So it'll never be a goal, but rather a process. And I think for me, the key takeaway that I feel that we are doing from here, the discussion is what that process should look like. I think that's the whole, like, and I'm getting a sense of the different discussions we are having. And I think that's a very core element of what the interdisciplinary approach should be looking into. And also, like, talking about, I think we're talking about conservation, we're talking about justice, very big words again, but then they're also defined in a very local, national context. You're talking about rights violations. You're talking about these other components that may not be looked at as scientific, but rather do inform these processes and do have an impact on the outcome. So I think it's and I think that's the process that we will always have to be renegotiating between scale, time, and everything. And I think that you see exactly we're talking about co-production, right? And I talked about that they have to have equal weight, exactly like what you talked about, that you're a PhD student, right? That where the scientific knowledge has an assumption of what that outcome should be, and will not take the reflection of another knowledge as being equal to, as an indicator to the outcome of that. And this is where we are saying, I want to share is that this is where I say that when these processes are taking place, an outcome definitely have to be is that those both knowledge systems have to have the equal weight to get that informed decision. Otherwise, you will have these kind of maps that are being made as co-produced maps. And of course, then they will also be used for power displacement violations. So this is where I think the process for us is that more than the goal is, I think, is these elements and these processes to be in place to really ensure that it actually going to be working on transformative change. Because we're talking about transformative change here I was also here to share about the gender aspect of it. I mean, it's as simple as having right to even sit at a village meeting table. Or going even out for a workshop or a meeting. So these are the lived realities. And this is where I think one of the gap is, that no matter whatever knowledge production you may do, you will definitely have these variables or glitches that we have to also see how it would be, taken on board and built forward from.
Great. I feel like there's been a lot of really good questions raised in the discussion, and I know that we have people listening that have questions, so I think we'll open up to that, and then we'll after a few questions we'll go into breakout groups where all of us are invited to go into the breakout groups, and we'll come back and take some final insights. So, are there any questions? And I think we may have some posted in the. Let's see. Rosario, or you can raise your hands if you have questions, or. Rosario saying we have. Rosario, maybe you could. Let's see. A question from Daniel Faith is that transformative change to address the biodiversity crisis raises challenges for equitable collaboration and co-production. Future generations benefit from biodiversity as variety, but how are future generations to be included in co-production? That's a really good question, because future generations are also here. So does anyone want to take that? Andy?
I think others know more about this than me, really. But yeah, I mean, who speaks for future generations? Through what interests and values, as a lens, is that mediated? So I think, yes, it's crucial to think in the long run, but that doesn't mean there's a particular view comes from it. It's basically is a first order sort of derivative of politics in general. It just means let's be pluralistic, have all the values and qualities that people here have emphasized in current political discourse to ensure that everyone's idea of the long run is really taken into account, and don't expect that there'll be a particular interest. I've heard neoliberal defenders of corporate growth making reference to future generations, and it's ontologically, it's not illegitimate, it's just politically in tension with biodiversity challenges. So let's not think that there's just one implication comes from that. Let's keep the politics in.
Okay, keep the politics in. And from Madhav Karki, we have a question in the chat on, he agrees that power dynamics and power relations are very important to achieve co-production in transdisciplinary manners. And his question is then, should we first do leveling the playing field, and how can it be done in a real world situation? And if we agree, then should we identify the lever that has the best opportunity to get transformative change? So how do we level the playing field? And we talked about tables, we talked about walking, listening. Anyone?
Yeah, maybe I can add something, and it's not the best answer here perhaps, but I think really thinking about dialogue. How do you create conditions for good dialogue, which is about active listening and share, and that it's safe for sharing, etc. So you can get to these underlying assumptions. And I think really co-production, it is an encouragement and a challenge for us to think about process. So several people have said that again and again. I think Nalini in particular, that it is a process, and we really need to think about the design carefully so that it can handle these issues that you bring up, Madhav. So what are conditions for good constructive dialogue that the dialogue itself is inclusive and engaging with the power asymmetries as well as the differences in knowledge systems and governance systems.
Lina, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, Mario already added, but just looking at this word around the leveling field, I think it's a very important one. Again, I think this is where, okay, if you're looking at, it's very multifaceted. So if I'm going to looking at how would you really engage in ensuring that women are part of this co-production, this approach is also very political. It's a very political affair because you are informing about an issue, but the approach given to that is justice, and looking at how justice for transformative change could be, from a holistic approach, would be a rights-based approach. Right, so I think that is where we are really looking at, is saying that to also clear out the leveling field. See, we are talking about knowledge production, but also maybe top down of how or who would the knowledge producers be. I think there's also, when you talk about, in other sense, we talk about institutional capacity building. I think within that transdisciplinary, group or discussion or a debate, I think this is also really very important to really share and discuss, and to really, take out like a principle or a guideline of saying these are how are possible ways of engaging when you talk about transdisciplinary within these approaches, so that everybody's included, everybody has but it's, however, I would also agree that saying it is very difficult than doing it. It's when you're talking about leveling field, it could be as basic as some local initiative. So again, it's I think sometimes maybe we are also to be aware not to put a rosy picture of saying that if we do this, we will truly get transformative change. So I think that is also, we really need to make sure that I think that's where some of the gaps we addressed, that part of it. That's also, I think, something that needs to be also held on to, and everybody definitely has a path in it to making sure how in our own spaces, however we engagement we are doing, that how do we really ensure that in that context, or however the engagement is taking the effort to leveling that field of engagement.
Great, thank you. Oh, Andy, you have something? We have.
Yeah, just very quick. I know I'm really just riffing on what you said. It's really important. I rather than too much talk in terms of leveling, for the reasons you gave, Marinalini, I think recognizing that balance needs bias in a world that we mustn't look at rosily, as you say, that is so non-level. Then to be balanced means being deliberately biased, not just leveling, but giving particular attention to those perspectives that are excluded. And the language of leveling sometimes means we have to be equally weighted, when in fact, to be neutral, we need to be really weighting those things that are excluded, whether it's on gender or race or whatever, class, whatever the different dimensions are.
Great. We have just a few more minutes for questions because we want to have breakout groups, but Helena and Maria have raised their hands. And we have a number of questions coming in the chat, and then we want to hear from Josie on her perspectives on these. So why don't we get Helena and Maria into the, whatever, the Zoom
Can
table.
you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Helena. I'm working as a researcher in a research institute in Northern Norway. And I'm just tapping into this whole co-production and adaptive knowledge creation through my work, because there's a lot of researchers here doing this. And I want to challenge you a bit on the actual doing of this, because as a young trying to learn this process, one way of thinking about it that I learned that some people are doing here is that actually involving people in the actual research question generating process, not just having the research question going out there and then, having people in already from the beginning of the project, and also writing them into the project proposal, for example, these kind of concrete ways. And I think one thing that is people are struggling is also the fatigue of participation, because in a lot of communities it's the same people that are involved in the same kind of participatory things. And one way we need to think more about this is that we as researchers we get paid going out there and doing this, but what about the people that spend their time talking to us and engaging and kind of actually understanding that this is something they do on top of all the other things that they do, which is, they don't necessarily have time to do and to learn everything and get into the process fully. So like an understanding of that burden in a way it is to be the other types of knowledge that don't necessarily get paid for having that type of knowledge, if you see what I mean. So challenge you a bit on that. And I actually also wrote my PhD about the power of maps. So I'm going to look up your PhD student, Josie. But one thing I realized coming from much more abstract academic background of the power of maps, and what does this mean to the people who are actually trying to struggle today with, for example, natural resource management, demanding maps for taking political decisions. And then I come as a researcher saying, oh, but the maps have power, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it doesn't matter to them because they have to relate to the fact that the state demands this kind of understanding, right? So we can say that we oppose this structural pressure, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, these people have to relate to it. And we're not talking future generations, we're talking right here and now. So I think one thing I'm starting to learn is that we can come with all this critique of concepts and power and blah, blah, blah. But for the people who actually need us, if you see what I mean, how can we kind of not just come there with abstract, but actually take it? Yeah, you see what I mean. So I think one way of doing it is to actually not have the research question from the start, but actually involving people throughout the whole process. And also that not all of us have to do this, because I'm not very good at this. And I don't think that I can become super good at there are other people who are really good at this. So we should like support the people. We shouldn't try to do all, if you see what I mean. That we need to kind of support the people who are good at this and maybe accept in my position that I will maybe not go out and talk to people, but I will sit here and write things. So it's a bit, yeah. I have many questions, but thank you.
Yeah, many questions. So Josie, why don't you take that, and then we'll hear Maria, and then we'll break into breakout groups, and we can raise some of the other questions there. So
yeah.
Josie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Helena. You raised so many, I think, really fundamental and important questions about actually doing this in practice. And I'm also really curious to hear more about your PhD research. So maybe you can connect afterwards, and also to Kara. But I think exactly Kara's been, and myself together, we've been grappling with this challenge of so many people come in and say, well, it's not decolonization if it's not this, or it's not decolonization if it's not that. And so she's really trying to remain, like, keep that openness. And she hasn't actually, she's in the planning stage right now. So she hasn't actually gone through the process of building that co-creation process yet. So she's really in the design stage, but she's trying to remain really open to kind of prioritizing this principle of usefulness for all involved. To really build those relationships and use that relationship building process as the grounds for deciding in the first place what would be important things to be mapping, what's an appropriate mapping approach, even in that context, and that builds on historical traditions, but also present day practices and values. And I think that that's not such as, there's so many different ways that you can think about mapping artistically, qualitatively. Of course, GIS has been used a lot, but in very different ways in terms of the political implications. And so I think that level of openness is very important to actually co-create both what is worth mapping, why would we map? And what's an appropriate way to go about that? Because if that's not co-designed, then ultimately it's a colonial mapping approach in terms of how it's brought in. So I know that's not really kind of an answer by example, because it's very much something that we're grappling with. But I think with the fatigue of participation, it's often because also people aren't really, it's not very useful for them. And so I think if you really prioritize relationships and usefulness, then hopefully that kind of counterweights that fatigue question, because that's not really in the framing. It's problematic actually if people are trying to kind of push something forward and just to deal with that burden. If it's a burden in the first place, that's part of the problem. Yeah, I'll stop there because I know we have plenty of things still to squeeze in.
Yeah, Maria, your question.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and kind of educative conversation. So I enjoyed it very much. The discussion is very much from the social science humanities perspective, since that is what the aim of network. I've been working many years in IPES, and since the network, SSH network, started kind of to highlight more and bring in SSH knowledge, I just would like to hear you reflect on if you see or how this, what you're saying relates to the difference between SSH and natural science, which is still dominating, and I think in an IPES kind of framing. Then, my question could be into two. First is, how do you foresee the acceptance of this kind of very interested but still very social science, humanities profile ways of reasoning? I can see that there are many people involved in IPES that haven't been thinking about decolonization, power, co-creation, and so on. I think it's crucially important to bring it in, but I also see the barriers to kind of convey the message also to the plenary. I guess that's a challenge for the transformative assessment that will be to be taken on. And also connected to a risk I see happening sometimes, that from a natural science perspective, say, okay, this means we should be bringing indigenous and local knowledge. And then they kind of not pay enough attention to also including SSH knowledge on power, governance, pedagogics, and so on. So it kind of gets social science like, now we should talk to the locals and not taking into account the systematic knowledge that have been gained through decades by SSH. Thanks.
We have a quick answer on that. We want to have some time for breakout groups. And I think Maria's question really gets at the heart of some of this that we want to talk about in those groups, about like what are the most promising ways of pathways of co-production given the on the ground reality. Does anyone want to just give a quick response while Rosario sets up the gets the breakout groups, and we'll just do a 10-minute breakout group, a fast one, just to share some ideas and come back and then connect again on insights. So Andy, you look like you're ready to go.
Sorry, I'm always, sorry about that. I always look like I'm ready to go. I'm not sure about the quality, but I mean, in a way, it's a great question, Maria. And in the question, though, contains part of its answer. What we're talking about transformation. You were framing it around the transformative assessment. What's being transformed? Are we transforming biology, the biology of the plants, or the ecology of the species? We're transforming societies and economies. So it's kind of interesting in itself that so many questions should be raised about what the role of social science humanities might be, when the thing we're looking at is the object that social science and humanities is supposed to look at. So even that there's a discussion is a sign of something quite important, I think. But you know, there is no body of knowledge that doesn't have politics in it. So there's no plug and play, let's put in this labeled knowledge or that labeled knowledge. They always have politics. That's why, in a way, qualities of plural, conditional, the sort of qualities of the process that so many people in this group have emphasized are more important than just thinking there's an outcome, we have to settle it. It's about how you go about deliberating, and you can't get out of that just by thinking you've got the right kinds of labeled knowledge. And if social science and humanities fulfill that role of reminding of that, then they're doing a good service. If they pretend to be proxies for these other things, then we're in dangerous turf and they're doing a disservice, I think.
Great. On that note, I think we're going to break out into groups of 3 or 4 right now and address these questions exactly about process. So briefly introduce yourself, and then, you know, think about what are the most important processes and pathways of co-production from your own perspective and experience. And Håkon, do you have anything to add to?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so why don't we go back, and so in 10 minutes we'll come back and then we'll share someone from the different groups, or all of us will come back and kind of reflect. This is a conversation that could go on and on and on, which we hope it does, and that's the point of these transformative conversations. So let's break out. We're back, and we'll just wait.
Yeah, I think very slowly everyone is getting back. We're still missing Mrinalini here.
She's here, but I cannot spotlight her.
Okay.
Because
she has to take the video off. Yeah, or video on. Yeah. But in any case, yeah, what came up in your breakout groups, if there's any insights, because we had a lot of questions still in the chat. I think our conversation has raised more questions and the need for continuing the conversation more than anything else. So anyone want to share what came up in the last 4 minutes?
Yeah, so this is open for everyone now to share what you talked about in the breakout rooms.
Maybe we could take a quick round here just to get your experience, because you represent a lot of views, and then.
Let me just start then before we are waiting. So for our group, we actually had, so we had 4 people, or 4 of us. And so what I did is actually, I will ask Dilman from our group, because I think I've talked a lot. So I asked him to take the floor and take some connections so we can also hear from other people who are on this webinar today. So Dilman, would you like to share some quick inputs from our group? 10 minutes was very short, but still.
No, thanks a lot. Indeed, it was very short and far too short. But in any way, I think we were talking a bit about 2 things or 2 dimensions that maybe have not touched, and that we haven't touched so much in the discussion. That was, first of all, the issue of complexity. I mean, complexity as a concept and as a manifestation of a certain arrangement on the ground. So what does a very complex setting mean whenever we need to set up collaborative and cooperative processes, right? And how does it change in the process due to complexity? I mean, what kind of additional things does it bring in that we haven't thought about? And then the second point was more the role of really individuals. I mean, because we were talking about communities, we were talking about different scales, but not so much about actual individuals. If particular individuals want to do something, what is it that they can do in order to become a transformative actor or to unfold transformative agency? Yeah, and I'm sure that there were countless other things we would have liked to discuss, but that was it so far.
That's great, thanks. So anyone else?
Maybe I can follow on that. Yeah, we had a really nice conversation with Helena, again, who asked the question, and also Sabina and Oscar. And we talked a lot about the constraints we feel trying to do to engage in meaningful co-production processes, especially within the projectification system, where you only have, especially in relation to PhDs, where you have 3 to 4 years. And how do you balance all of these challenges to really try to build meaningful relationships? And also with all of the biases that we have around Western knowledge being privileged in journals and so many other spaces, how do we really meaningfully design co-production processes within these constraints? But I guess also that raises the question of changing those system constraints. But if anyone else, I know we don't have a lot of time, but if anyone else wants to add anything from that group, please pop up your hand as well.
Andy or Maria, how about from your groups?
Yeah, again, it's great. We only just got started. Daniel raised some really good issues around from Marie's question in the plenary about the role of social science and humanities, and a lot more scope for challenging there. And Azura made a really interesting point around, or raised a question about evaluation in this context of plurality. How can you evaluate? I don't know if either Daniel or Azura want to say anything to those points. We didn't solve them, I have to say.
Yeah, it will continue, I think, the discussion. Thank you so much, Andy, for bringing it. Yeah, I was just thinking of, I agree totally that it's very important to think of this as a process and see the power dynamics behind it. But how do we make sure that there is a progressive knowledge that is moving, taking into account all these complexities and challenges and conflicts actually that are in place? So a kind of bringing together or synthesize, or what we call, is necessarily going to lead to a closure. That's what I was thinking, and I value in that sense Andrew's point about looking continually on these power struggles. So that's all I wanted to say.
So Maria, would you also like to step in shortly before we close?
Yes, I'll try to do this briefly. So it was a good discussion, but we didn't go so much further from introducing each other. But we were talking about practice, how to do this in practice, and what does it mean, and that the challenge, it can be useful, but there are also lots of caveats, and that it's not only about the knowledge, is also to bring knowledge together, but to get the knowledge into governance processes and decision making. And I thought the discussion also brought forward this tension between the urgency of doing and the actual governance process running along, and also the need to do this inclusive processes that can take time. So we have been talking about the importance of doing good processes, but that takes time. So sometimes good enough may actually have to be good enough sometimes as well. But it was a rich discussion. And please add from the rest of the group.
Thank you. We are running out of time. In my group, one point that came up from Rolf Lindbergh was that co-production can be a very time-consuming process. And I saw in the chat someone was raising issues about, how long does it take? Can we do this in a walk or a workshop and things? And so clearly, a 90-minute conversation is just a start, and I think this has to really continue, and the reflections. And so I will look forward to keeping these conversations going in some way or another, especially through the IPES assessments. So Håkon, do you have any final words?
No, just that there are so many interesting points that came up, and also all the questions in the chat that we didn't get to, but that are really great and interesting questions that we need to keep on discussing in other forums and trying to take this process even further.
Yeah, so with that, we'll close. And just, I want to say, we will be sending out the recording to this and invite you also to look at the first and second Transformative Conversations recordings. And I really want to thank Maria, Tim, Josie, and Andy for joining us today and sharing their expertise, knowledge, and insights on this. And yeah, and thank you all for joining and bringing together, making this a transformative conversation. So thanks a lot, and we will see you soon.
Yeah, thank you all for contributing.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Thanks for hosting.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good, thank you.